Euphrasie Barbier, Chapter 7. The time had now come for Euphrasie's long-awaited trip to the Pacific. She and her advisers agreed that Sydney was best abandoned. Only Sister Mary of Mercy was there now, and she wanted to leave the congregation. New Zealand now had two well-established communities, Napier and Christchurch, and more were being asked for. One had been firmly promised for Nelson, almost midway between Napier and Christchurch, though not on a direct route. Euphrasie had 6 more sisters for New Zealand, 3 of them for the Nelson Foundation, and Bishop Bataillon of Oceania had asked for 6 sisters immediately for Samoa and Tonga. All these new missions Euphrasie intended to start herself, so that the 12 young sisters going to them would not have to face the problems of Sydney. The novitiate planned for Sydney would be opened in New Zealand instead. The sisters there already had postulants helping them and being taught the basics of religious life. Euphrasie made a quick visit to Rome to get permission to open this novitiate, and also to set up the Pacific as a province of the congregation, authorized to make decisions without having to refer to the mother house. The first permission was granted, but the second refused. There are not enough sisters there to form a separate province. We advise you to arrange your communities so that an experienced sister can take responsibility for all the houses in her region, she was told. Euphrasie and her council consequently planned a reshuffle of the sisters in New Zealand. It would best be done while she was there herself. She and the latest group of missionaries worked hard to prepare themselves and their supplies for the long journey ahead. Just as they were ready to leave the mother house, disaster struck. France declared war on Prussia, and the enemy invaded from the northeast. It would be madness for me to leave the mother house at such a time, Euphrasie decided, but we must get the new missionaries out before the borders are closed. She went immediately to London to book passages for them, and stayed on for a short time to beg help from old friends. She was asked to bring her sisters to Kent to take care of a small orphanage. She promised to consider this offer when she had more time to think it over and consult her council. Back in France, the turmoil was growing worse by the hour. Several military disasters threw the whole country into a panic. The government was overthrown, and rival political groups were struggling to seize control in desperate attempts to save the nation from ruin and defeat. In Lyon, a revolutionary commune had taken control of the city. Euphrasie returned home to find the sisters very frightened. Ruffians were attaching themselves to rival political parties. Rumours, suspicions and panic turned easily to violence and bloodshed. The socialist groups were particularly antagonistic to anything religious. To them, religion meant conservatism, and they prided themselves on being revolutionaries. They had great schemes for confiscating church property for the good of the state. Down with religion, down with superstition, was their slogan. At 10 o'clock one night, a few days after Euphrasie's return, 4 armed men battered on the convent gate, demanding immediate entry. "We know there's guns in there," they roared. and powder and treasure. These places are rolling in it. And secret tunnels. Ah, yes, we know. Let us in. Open up. The gate was rocking under their blows, and there was no reasoning with the men, drunk as they were. The sisters were terrified. They had heard tales of unspeakable brutalities in other religious houses. When the revolutionaries began making serious attempts to unhinge the gate, the sisters decided that opening up voluntarily might defuse the situation. Standing as tall as she could, and mustering all her dignity, Euphrasie went up to the gate. "Stop that noise," she ordered. "Be quiet, and I'll let you come in and see for yourselves." They stood back unsteadily, muttering among themselves, and she slid the heavy bolt. They stumbled in. "Money!" demanded one of the ruffians. Euphrasie led them to the safe and unlocked it with trembling hands, praying all the time that she could find a way to pacify these louts. There was little loot in the safe, a few papers and some small change. The intruders did not know that scarcely 5 minutes earlier she had scooped the bulk of the housekeeping money into the deep pocket of her tunic. It was there right now, only inches away from them, and with it the deeds of the house and several other important documents. The revolutionaries trampled up and down through the house, and at midnight reinforcements came in through the front door. They looked eagerly into the dining room, thinking vaguely of grand monastic treasures, paintings and beautiful carved woodwork, silver plate and crystal goblets. Here there was nothing of any value, not so much as a silver spoon. The cellar door aroused their interest, and they tumbled down the steps. The dreary little hole had little to offer. "Treasures?" asked one. Reverend Mother shrugged. "Gunpowder?" She pointed to a pile of dust swept up into a corner. They stared at it for a moment, not clear enough in the head to recognize it. It was hardly enough to be impressive anyway. They were getting drowsy now. One struck a wine cask with the back of his sword. Even that sounded almost empty. "So that's the powder you're after, is it?" said Reverend Mother. "Well, lads, you'd do better chasing the Prussians than hanging around here." But they were hardly listening. They stumbled up the steps and out the front door. "We'll be back," they said. "We'll be back." And they were, every day for nearly 2 months. When it wasn't revolutionaries standing sentry at the doors, it was the National Guard, and at that time there wasn't much to pick between them. Day after day, the sisters put up with official interference, even inside their own house. Their groceries were examined minutely at the door. The milkman's can was investigated. The fruit was bruised, and the bread soiled by rough, inquisitive fingers. For days now they had not dared to undress at night, never knowing when the next intrusion would be. One morning, Sister Mary St. Raphael needed to fetch some coal from the cellar. Afraid to move around the house alone, she quietly beckoned one of the novices. Picking up the empty coal scuttles, they tiptoed cautiously down the narrow passage. At the turn of the stairs, they were confronted by 2 tipsy guards. The men were irritable, angered by their fruitless search for valuables to loot. Loudly, they demanded that Sister Raphael take off her shoes. The terrified novice bolted for help, and it was Reverend Mother herself who hurried back with her. Speechless and shaking, Sister Raphael had scarcely struggled out of her shoes when Mother Mary appeared at the top of the stairs, her tiny figure erect, her face grim and eyes flashing. "Sister, put your shoes on at once," she ordered sternly, and turning to the guards, "And you, how dare you touch her? Where is your commander? I shall have you arrested. Where is your commander? Take me to your commander." Furiously she advanced on the offenders. They began to stumble backwards, stammering, and turning they fled. The next day there was another intrusion. A group of soldiers, booted and armed, guns in hand and swords at their sides, swaggered in, announcing that they had come to inspect the whole house in the name of freedom and security. The fiery little Reverend Mother raced to the infirmary to head them off from that area. Inside lay a postulant desperately ill, possibly dying, and in no state to stand shock. This time Reverend Mother spoke very quietly but urgently. Please go away quietly. In here we have a young patient very ill indeed. She could even die." "We'll tell her she's safe now," blustered the leader, laughing coarsely, and with one arm he shoved Euphrasie back against the wall. Before she could regain her balance, the men had trampled through the doorway. Inside the spotless room, a light screen hid most of the white bed. Suspicious as always, the guards threw it aside. Roused by the noise, the dying girl gasped and cried out in terror. Abashed then, the intruder stumbled out, but the patient was already in a state of collapse. The sisters did their best to calm her, but her hours were already numbered. The sisters were so distressed that they hardly noticed where the ruffians went next. A few days later, when the postulant lay in her coffin, their tormentors were back in force. The guards were to carry the body to the cemetery, and not one of the grieving sisters could get permission to accompany her. It was unthinkable that any sister could be laid to rest alone among strangers, but this time no pleading could change the situation. Seeing how things were going, Euphrasie and her council decided to get another large missionary group away at once, as many sisters as they could spare from the mother house. They also made up their minds to go to Deal immediately and take over the orphanage they had been offered. If the situation here gets any worse, a house in England could save us, they reasoned. Hurrying from the council meeting, they called all the sisters chosen for mission and told them of their plan. They swung into action immediately, and the whole household helped with the hasty washing, sewing, and packing. "Passports," exclaimed Euphrasie. "We have to get permission now for every movement." She and Sister Jude hurried down to the Office for Public Safety. The newly set up officials were remarkably inefficient. "Passports? Passports?" they echoed. They shuffled from one desk to another, but no one seemed to know where the passports were. "You'll have to come back later," the sisters were told. They hurried home to do a little more packing and then returned to the office. Still the passports were not forthcoming. Again and again the sisters were put off, but finally a ruling was made. Each applicant has to come in person, 10 francs each. 2 by 2 they slipped down to the office that afternoon, 18 sisters in all, and each came back with her passport. On their heels came an official who declared that he had to check all luggage before it could be moved. The next morning he was back again with his team to inspect the contents of each box and stick a pass ticket to it. An hour later he was back again to superintend the departure, as he put it. Euphrasie had had enough of this cruel and senseless bullying. In desperation, she sent a message to a good man the sisters knew well, an officer of the National Guard. She had little hope that he could help them, but anything was worth trying. To the sisters' surprise and delight, he turned up promptly with several soldiers, decent-looking men, and announced that they were to take over guard duty at the convent that day. Euphrasie was now able to depart a little easier in mind for those she was leaving behind. The travellers' luggage was sent ahead to the railway station. The 18 sisters filed out the front door. Under her mantle, Euphrasie was carrying the archives and several irreplaceable documents she intended leaving with the sisters in England for safekeeping. One by one, the sisters passed between the two guards, standing at the front gate with fixed bayonets. A small, curious crowd gathered in the street. They had no idea what was happening, but some were ready enough to draw their own conclusions. "Prussians!" shouted one voice. "Enemies of the Republic! Smugglers! Gun runners!" a few more added. There was some foul language, but nothing worse happened. The railway journey was difficult. The trains were irregular, and the further north the sisters went, the worse conditions became. The trains were crowded with soldiers moving to and from the front line. There were trucks of wounded being evacuated, and refugee families moving away from the war zone. It was impossible to buy a through ticket to any seaport. It was even rumoured that the railways were to be blown up to hinder the Prussian advance. Hour after hour, the sisters kept on the move, sometimes by foot or by cart, sometimes by train on a small branch line. On the third day of travel, they reached Rouen, their last stop before the coast, late at night. "Let's wait at the station," they said, "and then we'll be ready whenever a train turns up." The station seemed deserted. A couple of officials were locking up for the night. "No, ladies," they said, "you can't use the waiting room. We are locking up now. There's no train until morning." "Please, please let us stay here," begged the sisters. "We are waiting for that train. We know no one in Rouen. It's so late, we are so tired. Please let us stay." "If you go in, we'll have to lock you in for the night," said the station master. To his surprise, the sisters were quite happy with this arrangement. Locked inside the waiting room, they sat down to rest as best they could. Someone lit a stub of candle. Their packed lunches had long been eaten to the last crumb. Their drinking flasks were empty, and there was no drinking water in the waiting room. Sister Wilfred and another young sister were standing on the long wooden seat to look out of the small clear pane at the top of a narrow window. "They've gone now," they said. "Reverend Mother, may we go out and buy some food?" Euphrasie looked up startled. The lookouts laughed mischievously. "The windows can be unlocked from up here, Reverend Mother. The ground is not too far down." Euphrasie quickly handed them the purse, and the others passed up their empty drinking flasks. "Oh, my dears, do be careful," she said. "Get us what you can." Quietly, they slid up the window and slithered out. Their faces shone pale in the square of darkness outside. After a brief whisper, the sisters inside slid the window closed again. They put out the candle and settled down to wait. Some had dozed off into an uncomfortable sleep before there was a tap on the window. Eagerly they pushed it up again and took packages from the outstretched hands outside. Others took hold of those hands and pulled the adventurers up over the sill and into the dark room. "Sorry we were so long," they panted. "We thought we'd never find an open shop." The window was closed again carefully, and the candle relit. They opened the packages. Coarse loaves, fresh and good, still smelling warm from the oven, and some pieces of cheese. With their portions in their hands, they all stopped to give thanks together for God's care. The trembling candle flame made a faint pool of light around them as they ate the small feast and drank the fresh water. It was daylight when the jangle of the station master's key woke most of them out of an uneasy sleep, and they readied themselves for the train. The rest of the journey was uneventful. The crossing was tolerable, and their ship landed them at New Haven early the next morning. Mother Mary led her flock immediately to a hotel for breakfast, the first decent meal they'd had since leaving the mother house. In London, they went straight to the home of a Mr. Milet, a friend of the Marist fathers. Here, the sisters for Oceania were to wait for Bishop Eloy, coadjutor or assistant to Bishop Bataillon, who was to take them to their missions. Unfortunately, Bishop Eloy was still held up somewhere in France, and no one knew when he would be ready to travel. That same day, Euphrasie set out for Deal. With her were the two sisters who were to take over the orphanage from Miss Boyes, the kind woman who had started it years ago when she was young and strong. Later there were old friends to visit too, before she set off for home. "If only I could get back to Lyon," Euphrasie said to the Duchess of Norfolk. "No, it's not money that's the problem this time. It's the revolutionaries. The harassment, the petty regulations about traffic, the permissions to come and go. After all the fuss about getting out, I doubt they'll let me in again." "What about a disguise, Sister Mary?" the Duchess suggested. "I could help you there, my dear." She rang for her maid and sent her to rummage in the wardrobes. "There you are, a decent little widow's outfit. Perfect," she laughed. She thought it was a great joke, as the maid snipped and stitched to fit Euphrasie. As she set off again, Euphrasie was glad of her disguise. She felt inconspicuous among the crowds. All in black, silk dress, rich cloak, fashionable bonnet, and small hold-all, she looked the perfect picture of a respectable widow travelling quietly across war-torn France. At last she reached the mother house. It was barely 3 weeks since she had left, but the sentry on duty was a stranger. He was a National Guardsman, she was relieved to see, a decent-looking lad, but he was not prepared to let her through the gate. The house now billeted 20 soldiers, whose luggage and stretcher beds filled 2 large rooms and a corridor of the convent. In effect, the place had become a military outpost, and security measures were strict. But I want to visit the sisters, Euphrasie explained. Sorry, no visitors allowed, he answered firmly. But they would want to see me. Please go and ask. Sorry, lady, no one in or out except the nuns. Euphrasie took heart. Well, I am one of the nuns, she said. Come off it, lady, he said. I'm not that silly. Orders is orders, and orders says no one in or out except the nuns. I'm sorry, lady, but you'd better buzz off. He held up his bayonet fiercely, with a scowl that sat oddly on his fresh, good-natured, boyish face. Euphrasie turned away, wondering what to do next. Ah, the Sisters of St. Charles down the road, she said to herself. They've always been good friends of ours. I wonder if they are allowed to visit. The Mother Superior was astonished to find Euphrasie on her doorstep. Yes, I have been allowed to visit your sisters, she said. Come, Reverend Mother, let's try. The young guard saluted the visiting sister sheepishly. Obviously he knew her. He ignored the little widow woman at her side. All right, sister, but just 1 hour, sister, he said. As the door closed behind them, the visitor beamed. Don't worry, Reverend Mother, you're safe now, she said. I won't go out until they change the guard. They won't know I've left you inside. The plan worked perfectly. Everyone was surprised and delighted to see Euphrasie again so soon. They were enthralled by her account of the journey to London and laughed heartily at her latest adventure at the front door. Suddenly, Euphrasie stopped. We have only a short time, sister, she said. Let us have a council meeting immediately. She could see that the mother house was relatively safe for the present, but she proposed that 2 more sisters be sent to Deal at once. The council heartily agreed, and 2 young sisters were sent to prepare hastily for immediate departure. After another change of guard duty, the new sentry barely glanced at the apparent widow lady and her 2 adult daughters saying goodbye to the sisters. Again, the trip across France was slow and difficult, though Euphrasie had learned fast from her earlier experiences. Conditions had deteriorated, but they finally reached the coast and crossed the channel safely. The weary travellers knocked at Mr. Milet's door at 10 o'clock one night. Their surprised host quietly and kindly let them into the sleeping house. The next morning, the missionaries for New Zealand were to board their ship. They were up early, packed and ready to go, when Euphrasie walked into the room. They could hardly believe their eyes. They had resigned themselves to not seeing their mother again. They rejoiced that she was able to accompany them to the boat, see them settled into their cabins, and stay with them until the boat was ready to cast off. Back at the Milet home, Euphrasie at last had time to talk to the group for Oceania. They still did not know when they would sail. They were waiting for their Marist bishop, still delayed by the troubles in France. It was good to be together with their mother for a while, before their final parting, but the end could not be put off for long. Euphrasie encouraged them. Love our Lord, my dears. Suffer all that he wills. Be faithful. That is all that matters. She had to continue. I'm sorry that I cannot wait to see you off. You understand, don't you? I am leaving for Deal today with these 2 sisters, and from there I must hurry back to France. Ah, poor France. Every day it gets worse. Pray that our travels will be safe. Pray for our congregation. Pray for France. By 16th of October, Euphrasie was back at the mother house. This time there was no sentry at the gate. The place seemed abnormally quiet. She let herself in, closing the gate quietly behind her, and rang the bell at the locked front door. After a long silence, she heard a cautious movement, and the door opened a narrow crack. With a gasp of surprise and pleasure, two sisters pulled her inside and greeted her affectionately. "Yes, we're all here and all safe, so far," they answered her queries. "But Mother, what is going to happen? There are such stories going about, and every hour the Prussians are coming closer to Lyon. Sometimes at night we think we can hear the guns far away." Euphrasie listened to them. Calm and quietly, busy and prayerful though they appeared to be, the sisters were terrified. No one knew for sure how the war was going, but there were bad rumours and a sense of impending disaster. Many people had already fled from the city. The soldiers were gone from the house. It was rumoured that 20 more would replace them, but there had been no word from the army. On the last day of October, Euphrasie and another sister went cautiously into town to do some shopping. As they passed the railway station, they noticed a group of soldiers, sick and dirty looking, many of them roughly bandaged. "They must be waiting for a hospital vehicle," commented the other sister, and Euphrasie agreed. When they returned from their shopping, the men were still there, most of them slumped on the platform, only a few steps from the train. They seemed lost, probably strangers to Lyon. One man, propped on a single rough crutch, was standing nearby, staring out vacantly into the street. "Where are your officers?" Euphrasie asked, concerned. He shook his head slowly. It seemed that he hadn't the strength to speak. Another man shrugged vaguely. "No idea," he said. The sisters bustled around the station asking questions. "I really don't think anyone is coming to get them," said one of the railway staff. "Some orderlies just pull them off the train. All the rest went on." The sisters were shocked. They suddenly began to realize the desperate straits of the French army, forced to drag its wounded from the battlefield, only to abandon them to strangers. Euphrasie went back to the soldiers on the platform. "Can you walk?" she asked. "Would you like to come with us?" They nodded dumbly and began to struggle to their feet, helping one another to shuffle along after the sisters. "Our guards haven't returned yet," Euphrasie said to her companion, "but their stretcher beds are still in the convent. These poor fellows could sleep on them until the army comes back." As they neared the convent, she hurried ahead to summon the community and tell them of her discovery. "Sister Jude, can you organise the nursing?" she asked. Sister Jude's cheerful face frowned as she rapidly made plans and picked out her assistants. "Reverend Mother," whispered the sister cook, "there's only enough for the sisters' meal. Shall we feed the men first? We could find something later for the sisters." While the men swallowed some food, the sisters emptied the linen cupboard and began to make up beds on the small canvas army stretchers. As they finished eating and drinking, Sister Jude checked out each man and directed him to one of her nurses. The soldiers were exhausted. Some had to be peeled or cut out of their filthy uniforms. Some fell onto the beds, too tired or weak to be moved again. "We need a doctor, dressings, boiling water, carbolic, soap, salt, ointments," said Sister Jude, and her assistants hurried to the kitchen and the medicine cupboard. 2 sisters hurried down the street to the guards' headquarters. "We offered our place as an ambulance at the beginning of the war," they said, "but we've heard nothing since. Now we have 26 soldiers in bed. Who is responsible for them?" The man at the desk could give them little help, but he did direct them to a doctor who had volunteered his services for ambulance duty. As they left the building, he called after them, "Don't forget that you are entitled to display a Red Cross flag over your door to protect your hospital." In the infirmary, the nurses were quietly at work with wash basins and towels. The postulants were carefully tearing clean old sheets into bandages and rolling them neatly. The trickiest job of all was to uncover and treat the injuries. Some were horrible wounds, never properly cleaned, and now caked with filthy dressings. Others didn't look serious, but their victims were obviously very ill. Infected wounds and neglected bronchitis had often turned to blood poisoning and pneumonia, and serious illnesses had been aggravated by exposure to cold and hunger. Some men seemed not to have a scratch on them, but death was already in their faces. Sister Jude never stopped work, except to pause beside a patient for a cheering word. Sometimes she nudged Euphrasie and whispered, "Can you spare a moment, Mother? That one, sit with him. See if you can prepare him. He hasn't long to go." The sisters grew to know and love their patients, sitting with them through the long nights, listening to their griefs and fears. Crazed with fever and pain, many a brave man wept like a child, calling for mother or wife in the endless hours of darkness. The sisters prayed with and comforted those afraid to die. They encouraged those who had to endure painful treatments. "Sister, sister, give me something to bite on," a man would sometimes whisper urgently, and his nurse would quickly fetch a clean folded handkerchief to put between his teeth as he clenched them. The doctor had no anaesthetics. At the best of times, such new inventions were available only in a few big city hospitals. When the pain became unbearable, the doctor would sometimes stop and nod to the sister helping him. "Brandy," he would say quietly, and sister would hurry to fetch some of the precious liquid. A quick gulp of spirits on an empty stomach, enough to cause a stupor, was the only painkiller available. There was always the hope that the sufferer would wake later, stitched up, cleaned and rebandaged, with no memory of his ordeal. Doctor and nurse often hoped that the patient would faint from pain. It was risky, but it made the cutting and probing much easier for everyone concerned. In the long hours of sitting, soothing, calming, bathing fevered faces, spooning cold water between parched lips, the sisters wrote letters too, sometimes a comforting last message for his family from a boy who would never see them again, sometimes a cheering letter to say that a lost son was alive, safe, and starting to make a good recovery. Along with the physical care, the sisters worked with great success at getting their patients back to the practice of their faith. Broken-hearted families were comforted by news that their lost son had died with every spiritual help, cherished in body and soul to the end, and laid to rest in holy ground. The sisters' greatest joy was to see the men on their feet again, walking in the sunshine, resting in the garden, and every day growing stronger in body and spirit. Many of those who went home kept in contact by letter. Letters came from families too, sharing their joy over the safe return of a loved one long given up for dead. There was news too of rebuilt homes, new work, marriages and births. There was even a surprising letter from incorrigible young Charles Boyer, who had always teased the sisters unmercifully, laughing off their concern at his irreverent behaviour and irreligious jokes, and distressing them by his absolute refusal of the sacraments. He had reached home safely, he said, and after celebrating rashly with wild friends, had had a relapse of his illness. "I often thought of you, sisters," he wrote, "and I was sorry. I remembered how kindly you had nursed me, and how patient you were with my impertinence. I have changed my ways now. I am sorry for my bad behaviour, and I ask you to forgive me. I will never forget God's mercy to me, or the blessing the chaplain gave me as I was leaving, or the tender care you gave me when I was so ill. You were all truly mothers to me. Once more, pardon and thanks." "Ah, thanks be to God. God bless the poor boy. God bless him," the sisters murmured, overwhelmed with gratitude, for Charles's spiritual state had worried them desperately. But there were other letters with sad news. It was heartbreaking to hear months later that a healthy young convalescent had left them only to be sent back to battle and death. The army authorities were too hard pressed to come looking for their men, but they were well aware of the sisters' ambulance. More and more men were directed to the mother house until it housed 45 sick and injured soldiers as its regular number. Euphrasie appealed again and again for some help from the military authorities, but all she got was promises. Good friends and neighbours often sent in food for the soldiers and the sisters. Some of Euphrasie's old Irish parishioners in London even took up a collection for the suffering soldiers. As the war dragged on, Lyon became more and more impoverished. Local people could no longer help the sisters. Those who owed them money could no longer pay their debts. Every part of France was in the same predicament. Euphrasie could not ask even her family for help. Recent news from them had been bad. Naomi had been widowed last year, and now Louis wrote to say that she had recently died of smallpox at the age of 37. Her tiny baby daughter Alex had followed her to the grave a few days later. Her two young sons, Gabriel and Gaston, had come to live with their uncle Louis, his wife Amanda, and their little Louise, and Louis promised that he would bring them up as his own children. Euphrasie dreaded leaving the mother house at such a time, but there was no help for it. She knew she must go on a begging trip. None of the sisters had died yet of overwork or illness, but they were all so run down physically that a few more weeks of semi-starvation could finish them off. She travelled north through France, finally reaching Paris with difficulty. Her search for help seemed hopeless. Many of her old friends had fled from the war-torn city, and those who remained were mostly in desperate need themselves. She begged mostly in vain, and even found herself giving away the few francs she had collected, because the people she met were in worse straits than herself. Out of 90 people now in the house, we have at least 75 ill, sisters, orphans, and soldiers. Some are suffering from smallpox, and others from severe influenza, she wrote to one of the sisters in the Pacific. And that was another anxiety. After all these months, there was still no word from the last lot of missionaries to go to the Pacific. No news of their arrival, no answer to any of her letters. Once again, Euphrasie set out for England. On her way to Deal, she stopped first in London, collecting a little money from friends as she went around. She feared that the long silent community at Deal might be almost as poor as the people of war-torn France. It worried her that she had heard nothing from them lately. The sisters at Deal were delighted, but not at all surprised to see her. "Ah, Reverend Mother, you're here at last," they cried, sweeping down upon her with kisses and greetings. "And the others, where are they? We're all ready. When will they arrive?" "What do you mean? What are you saying?" Euphrasie asked. "We knew you were on the way," they said. "When we had no word from you, and no answer to our letters, and all your mail began to arrive here, we knew you were coming. And what has happened to our poor mother house?" Astonished, Euphrasie took the pile of mail they brought in to her, packets and letters addressed to her and sisters of the Lyon community. "We have had no mail at all from France," said the letters from the Pacific, "and none of our letters sent to the mother house has had a reply. So we presume that the whole community has moved to safety in England. We are longing to hear how you all are." Euphrasie was stunned, both horrified and relieved. The poor sisters, she cried, "and they have had no reply from England either." She stretched out her hand to paper and ink. The sisters in Deal were in need of Euphrasie's attention too. They told her about their unexpected difficulties, and she found that money was not their greatest worry. It was the orphanage that was breaking their hearts, they said. Or rather, it was good Miss Boys, the kind woman who had left the orphanage in their care, who was the source of all their trouble. Miss Boys, a devout woman all her life, both as an Anglican and as a Catholic convert, had cared for her aged mother until the latter's death. Then, middle-aged herself, she had sold their little cottage and rented a large house as a home for 15 little orphan girls, the destitute children of local fishermen. Here they had lived happily with Miss Boys until she felt that her health was failing. She and the children had prayed desperately for help, and the sisters seemed to come as an answer to their prayers. When the happy day of the takeover had arrived, Miss Boys moved out to a small house nearby, wanting to keep some contact with the little girls she had mothered so lovingly, and the sisters moved in, filled with enthusiasm for their new project. From the first day, the new arrangement was a disaster. The children wept and complained. Miss Boys was broken-hearted, and the sisters were shocked and disillusioned. Everything they did seemed to make matters worse. One sister wept over the unfriendliness and ingratitude of the children. Another angrily blamed Miss Boys. Euphrasie was neither shocked nor surprised. The children must be happy under the sisters' care. I attach great importance to this, she said. But sisters, it will not happen all at once. Of course they will be sad at first. Of course they will make comparisons. And it will be the newcomers who will be blamed. They do not know you yet. There must be one sister who is especially responsible for them, who will be with them constantly like a mother, who will listen to their little joys and sorrows, and guide each one according to her needs. But this will take time. No one is to blame, not yourselves, not Miss Boys, not the children. With patience things will come right. To Euphrasie, the financial state of the house was a much more urgent problem, for she could not bear the thought that the children might be cold or hungry, or lack anything necessary. She went up to London to beg again, and returned with enough money to stock up the storeroom for a short time. She visited Miss Boys to reassure her, and talked to the children herself. In fact, whenever she was at Deal, she made a point of spending time with the orphans, and when she was away, inquired of them by letter and sent them her love. She soon knew their names and their backgrounds and their little foibles. She was very conscious of their helplessness and the loss of their natural parents. These poor children will have nothing but their health and their strength as inheritance, she reminded the sisters. They are at an age when they eat well and would suffer from having only bread and butter for a meal, even if that is what they once lived on. It does not matter that they had nothing better in years gone by. I suppose people did their best at the time. Always add a cooked meal with a large enough portion for each, and larger portions for the 14 and 15-year-olds. Her kindly visits and the sisters' growing confidence and warmth began to dispel the children's fear and resentment. Gradually, a timid friendliness grew into real affection between the orphans and the sisters, just as Euphrasie had foreseen. When Euphrasie returned to Lyon a few weeks later, the war was suddenly over. The infirmary was almost empty, and so was the storeroom. One morning, to their great surprise and relief, the sisters were summoned to collect their refund for the expenses of running the hospital. Their delight was short-lived. The payment was so small that they could hardly believe it. In 8 months, some 400 men had passed through the hospital, but what they had been given would not have kept 40 for more than a week or two. At this time of the year, the sisters at the mother house usually ran a lottery to supplement their funds, but this year it was out of the question. The sisters at Napier, knowing how desperate the situation was in Europe, wrote to say they were sending 3,000 francs by registered mail, but the money never arrived. After waiting for more than 2 months, Euphrasie wrote to tell them the bad news. These days, she said, registering a letter is enough to guarantee that it will never reach its destination. In spite of her money worries, she expressed surprise when the sisters at Lyon wrote asking permission to accept one more orphan at the Mother House orphanage. "Why do you ask permission?" she answered. I am astonished that you did not say yes immediately. Our Lord knows our great need. No doubt he wishes to test the sincerity of our faith and love of poverty. His good pleasure should be enough for us. He will come to our aid in some other way. Right now, money was Euphrasie's greatest worry. With the war ended, she felt that she should go at once to visit the Pacific, but she simply had no money to pay for her passage. Worse, she was already deeply in debt for the travelling expenses of the last sisters who had gone to the Pacific missions. In desperation, she wrote to Cardinal Barnabo, now the congregation's official representative in Rome, and begged him to get her sisters some kind of subsidy from the propagation of the faith, the central council for all missionary organizations in the church. She was happy with the result. No subsidy was granted directly to the sisters, but from now on, all travelling expenses of sisters going to Marist missions would be paid to the Marist fathers. That was one tremendous burden lifted from her shoulders. Requests were coming in for new convents in England and in France, but Euphrasie refused tactfully. There was a limit to the burden her sisters could carry, she knew. She also wanted to get the congregation out of debt. Next time, she said to everyone, next time I shall go with the missionaries myself. And she began to prepare herself and everyone else for this journey. Her absence from France and England might last for several years. Deal and the mother house would have to manage without her, but there were several things she needed to do before leaving Europe. The first was a quick trip to Rome to get final approval for the printing of the rule and constitutions, the ceremonial, and the prayer book, drawn up especially for the Sisters of Our Lady of the Missions. She hoped to be able to take all these with her when she finally set off for the distant missions, and was delighted when all her business passed without a hitch. One last thing she wanted to leave in place before she left: permission to have perpetual adoration of the Blessed Sacrament in the chapel of the Mother House, and this too was granted. The sisters were overjoyed with this great privilege, and Euphrasie had to moderate their enthusiasm somewhat. They were long accustomed to an hour of adoration during the day, but nighttime vigils were much more demanding, no matter how great a sister's goodwill and piety. Mother Mary and Mother Prioress carefully drew up a roster, taking into account each sister's health, age, and daily workload. Every sister who keeps vigil during the night must have sufficient sleep before she gets up next morning, Reverend Mother ordered firmly. She hoped that no one had noticed how often she herself was working and praying quietly long into the night hours, because she simply could not fit in all she needed to do during the day. When 4 more sisters set off for New Zealand and the islands, Euphrasie saw them off from Gravesend, but she was not yet ready to go herself. The houses in France and England were in too perilous a state financially. Over the years, thousands of francs had been spent on supplies to establish the Pacific missions. Euphrasie decided it was now time to ask the New Zealand houses to repay some of that outlay. She was sure that she could rely on their growing prosperity and habitual generosity. In Deal, Miss Boys died, and left a modest legacy to the orphanage. Some careful planning and new loans finally brought the money problems of the mother house to a manageable state. At the same time, ill health among the sisters had dropped to an all-time low. The time seemed right for Euphrasie to make a move.